Hi, everybody. The question always arises every year. How do I actually write a DH thesis? How do I write my MRE? How do I propose it? Who do I talk to? Does the DH program have to approve what I'm doing? So this little video is just me inviting you to talk to me directly about any questions you might have, but also to try and answer some of the questions that you might have right off the bat. Now, the first thing, let's get this out of the way. When the program was founded almost 10 years ago, it's written into those original documents that the DH program has to approve the proposed topic. However, in practice, this has evolved so that we don't actually assert DH approval over your thesis work or your MRP. That is something that you sort out with your advisor. And what we in the program aim to do instead is to collaborate with you and collaborate with your advisor to bring out those DH aspects. So you develop your proposal in conjunction with your advisor and dial me into those conversations. And what I will do is help to identify and enhance and bring out the DH aspects for you. So the first question you'll need to ask yourself as you're trying to develop this idea is, well, is it DH? Remember, there's a reflexive circle here. If it interrogates the digital from a humanities perspective, if it interrogates the humanities from a digital perspective, if it has those elements in it somewhere, then it is DH. Is it DH enough? You're bringing into your thesis work, your MRE work, everything you've learned in the program so far. You're going to interweave all of these elements. So yeah, it'll be enough. The best work always has those elements in dialogue with each other. What is not DH is when you're missing that critical reflective self-awareness. When that's not there, then that can be a problem. So let's consider for a moment an example. Say a student is working on exploring the patterns of incarceration from a historical database of court records. And the thesis concludes that there is an association between gender and type of crime over time. Is that a DH thesis? It is certainly computational, but computational and DH are not necessarily the same thing. It could be a DH thesis if the student uses that quantitative work to think through how the database itself is an instrument of surveillance, how the act of quantification of law breaking itself helps define when laws are broken and who and what constitutes criminality. It could be DH also if the student reflects on their own decisions about what counts, right? And on the choices that they make as they work through this material and what the cumulative effect that has on the patterns that they're ultimately able to see. How the act of putting everything into rows and columns and spreadsheets flattens human experience. But if those elements or similar elements are missing, then the DH dimension to that work is not present, and there's a problem there. So I want to take a moment and we will take a look at some past DH work. So I've got two screens here, so now I'm looking at my other screen, which you are seeing. So here is a piece by Alessandro Marcon from a few years ago from linguistics, looking at a kind of discourse analysis of the figure Edward Snowden. And I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but this is a very traditional looking thesis. But if you see all of what's going on here, Macron has broken things into background, theoretical perspectives, methods, finding, analysis, and discussion. But in here, in all of this discussion, there's this constant cycle of thinking back through about what the fact of the digital is doing for how we understand the constructions of Edward Snowden. And we've got the implications, and it's all there. You know, there's in the appendices here, he's got ideas about looking reflectively at that data, at that process, and it's all in there. So this is a very traditional looking thesis, but it's a DH thesis. Here is a piece by Ingrid Reiche from English from a few years back, where she actually builds the critical apparatus for comparing separate published editions of a history of the pirates. This portion of the work really still looks like a traditional thesis. But then there's this whole chapter here that discusses what she has learned about the history of the pirates through building her own critical apparatus. And she actually links through in the thesis to a website that she has built to support the work. Okay, so here she has built this critical apparatus, and consequently the rest of her thesis is a bit shorter because this is frankly a lot of work. Here's one from history from a few years ago, Pembroke Soundscapes by Rob Blades, where he maps historical soundscapes. He identifies historical sounds from historical literature, re-records those sounds or finds original recordings, adds them to the interactive map, and then ties oral histories to these locations, builds timelines. And he also put all of his research notes online on a searchable wiki type interface. And then his reflection itself is built using what's called Gitbook. And again, it's all right here. Now, this fully digital work, he did in fact have to create a PDF of all of this stuff in order to submit things for the official record keeping of the university. That's something that we often have to do in digital work. Even if your thing is completely born digital, some kind of PDF gets created, which is a nuisance, but that's just the way it is. And then finally, we have an example from Christina Wood from a few years ago about sonifying different aspects of historical environmental data connected to the Ottawa River. And her final essay looks, again, not like a thesis, but rather an essay. This was an essay project, the MRE. So it is a bit shorter than an MRE would be because so much of it is going on online. So these are four very different examples of what a DH thesis can look like. So how do you go about doing it? Well, it helps to have certain habits, right? Keep notes about your process. Document the decisions you take, about the choices you make and why you've made them. Use these choices and as fodder for reflection, right? Think about how your choices affect what you are seeing in the material that you're studying. Think critically about the way various digital technologies privilege the different ways of seeing and understanding. And remember that whatever digital technologies or tools that you're using are built by particular people in particular places and time with a particular kind of ideal user. As far as digital tech goes, 9 times out of 10, this means white men. In technophile cultures, for other white men. So think through what that implies for your work. Now, we often say in DH that building is a way of knowing, and as you've seen, many DH projects or theses, they often do build something, an immersive simulation, a database, critical edition, sonification, interactive map, whatever. When you build something, and you have something public facing, it should have a discussion somewhere on it, and you can call this paradata or colophon or discussion of how this was built, and you draw from those process notes to explain the technical issues that will help your reader or your user or your target audience understand what it is that they're looking at. And that information may or may not appear in the reflexive paper itself or the thesis, but it's critical that it is there. If you have something public facing on the web, you really absolutely need to have something like that, and that can be used in the essay itself. But remember, you don't necessarily have to build something public-facing for it to be DH, right? So the question now is, well, okay, scope and scale. Some of these projects are enormous amounts of work, and it is really important that you think through the feasibility of the idea. And remember that what's feasible for a thesis isn't necessarily feasible for an MRE. An MRE might produce a vignette, a sketch, as it were, a proof of concept for something more ambitious in the future. It's critically important that you discuss expectations with your supervisor and with me early on, so that we can work out what is doable and feasible. Often students are super ambitious, and I love that, but I also don't want this to be the thing that breaks your mental health. Okay? So we have to be feasible. It has to be something that's doable. In terms of structuring your thesis or your MRE, if you have a Paradata section on the digital thing that's public-facing, if you've got that, talk to your advisor about how this can impact expectations around length. Many departments will reduce. Try to avoid having a section in the thesis or the MRE itself called, and now the DH part, right? Just draw from DH literature throughout the thing that you build or the thing that you write. Weave that perspective into the fabric of your thinking. DH work can be very reflective, okay? The style of that kind of writing really depends on your home discipline and its expectations. Be aware of the conventions for your discipline. Seek out DH work in your field that is similar in scope and approach, and note how they handle it. Okay, so now proposing your DH thesis. Okay, develop your proposal in conjunction with the processes appropriate to your department, and bounce the ideas off the program coordinator, i.e. me, early on. You could write to your advisor, Dear Advisor X, I am thinking about exploring Y in the context of Z for my thesis, for my MRE. I have CC'd Dr. Graham, who is the DH program coordinator, to get their perspective on the DH aspect to my work. Okay, just a little email like that will open doors, and I will work with you and your advisor, okay, to bring it the best in what you are proposing. Remember that each department has its own culture, and it has its own processes for helping students work out their MRE or thesis. Work within that. Look up previous student work in your department that was DH. It helps to have precedence, but dial me in early, okay? And during this entire process, keep talking to your peers in your cohort and in your department. Remember, if something digital that you're fighting with, if it doesn't come in 30 minutes, it's not going to come in 3 hours. Don't do that to yourself. Stop, write down the error messages, take some screenshots, write out what you were trying to do, then take a break. Send all of that to me. Send it to a trusted confidant. Ask for help. It is not a failing. It is not a weakness to be asking for help on this stuff. Things I try screw up 90% of the time. I spend a lot of my time just trying to learn how to do something. And I ask for help from my peers all the time. It's okay to do that, and I really, really super encourage you to do that. I will gladly look at anything. I will help troubleshoot. I will help brainstorm. I want to bring out the best in your possible work. So dial me in. Good luck. You're going to do great.